Hi there. Welcome to session 2 of To Be or Not to Be, that is the question. It's for all those who are interested in the compatibility of Christianity and science, and that might include you, and you, no matter where you come from, what your worldview is, if you're a Christian or an agnostic or an atheist or whatever. The origin of life is really the topic, and it's mainly about biology. Because as you will see just now, biology is such a large discipline. There's so many aspects to it. And to put all this in 30 or 40 minutes is going to be very difficult. But I'll give it a try anyway. The question is, in the connection with to be or not to be, evolution or creation. So there's a tiny bit of paleontology in there. There's quite a bit on genetics and cellular biology. And we're not going to go too deep into Genesis, but I just want to show that the ideas of Genesis 1 are actually not so far-fetched. Okay, let's start. Biology is very large, it's very complex. As an engineer who's worked on multidisciplinary type programs, mechanical and chemical and electrical in big projects, I have an appreciation for complexity, but I tell you what, biology is much more complex than even the space shuttle or anything like that. And the complexity is it's of course in a different type of environment, but we're not going to go there. I just wanted to point out to you that I could have talked for an hour or two on external biology, like homology, which means the similarity of looks. You know, a mouse looks like a dog, or a cat looks like a horse. They all got 4 legs, they got a head, they got a tail, blah, blah. The amazing thing on human biology is, of course, that we have a couple of characteristics that no other animal has got on this planet. We can articulate through language. We can appreciate art and beauty. We are very creative. We know aesthetic things. We can appreciate that. We can think abstractly, and our mathematical tools have really shown that to a very, very high degree. We also have morals, and we are subject to moral laws. We have a conscience, or some of us at least, and the body is extremely complex in all its subsystems and parts and so on. And of course, human beings can make any area on this planet and even off this planet their living space. Animals cannot do that, and vegetation cannot do that at all. They don't even have mobility. But when we look at eternal biology, which we will also do, we see very clearly in the human body there is structure, there are senses to sense the environment that we are living in, and it is an amazing system, this body of ours, consisting of many, many subsystems. Of course, there is a thing like health and disease, and we will address that very, very briefly. The amazing thing to me, again, as a technical person, is there is a similarity in the blueprint for all of us, but the differences are in the detail. And there are no two people of these almost 8,000 million that we are on this planet that are really the same. There's also in the eternal biology an important aspect, and that is that the simple cell, of which you got 100 trillion, roughly, these cells all have a metabolism, but they also seem to be prone to mutations. There is, of course, also energy production and energy consumption in our bodies, otherwise we wouldn't be alive. There are amazing things that are happening in our body when the blood coagulates and a wound actually closes up and it's not leaking blood anymore. And there's, of course, the amazing, amazing effect of reproduction, which we might take for granted, but it surely is not when you look in the detail. And of course, we also have microbiology, where we look at the cells in a bit more detail, the microcirculation of the blood and the nerves, and lots of amino acids that are floating around in this body of ours, proteins that are made, and little energy generators that actually work on protons and not on electrons. and a little bit on genetics and DNA. Now, you can see the spectrum of stuff. So I had to select a couple of things. We must also remember that the purpose of this series is really not to make you a biologist, but to show you a couple of things out of science. But the other thing that we must always remember is that what is real, what is here, is natural and is prescriptive. So the laws of nature, you remember, are prescriptive, and science is descriptive. As you will see or appreciate, life is really not simple, biological life. So life is either almost commonplace everywhere in the universe, or it is really a miracle to be here on this planet. And we will get there when we talk about cosmology, when we talk about geology as well. But you know, the man who started all this off, we started on the wrong foot with Charles Darwin. Why? Because Darwin wrote a book that took him, I think, something like 20 years in total to complete, which initially was called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. That's about 160 years ago. And of course, for his time, he had some good ideas maybe, and he scribbled them on a serviette as we would do today. But it's interesting that he wrote this book and then changed the title of that book and added stuff as time went on. And the 6th edition of the book, which was really the final one, the title was changed to On the Origination of Species by Development from Earlier Forms, not by Special Creation. And of course, atheists were very happy to have such a book, because here is now somebody who is giving a hypothesis which may or may not be true at this stage, but which can make life sort of more bearable for an atheist. So this little sketch of Charles Darwin that is there in the corner was really the starting point of a thinking process that caused a lot of this. The main conclusion of this book, though, is man is descended from some less organized form. So, as I said last time, it is like, you know, you were goo, and via the zoo, the other animals, it became you. And so we will see if that is actually still valid 160 years later. Now, gradual changes within species and adaptations to the environment provide different colors and size and other characteristics used in breeding. And it's been done for hundreds and thousands of years, breeding of plant and animals. And these will eventually sort of give rise to new species. That's what Darwin says. And that is the thing. The biblical expression of the original creation of animals was actually different kinds, baramin. And this kinds is different to species. And I will, before you switch off, I will explain in a bit more detail just now. Now, a lot is said about mutations, but I think there's one point that has to be remembered for this whole talk. Mutations lose information. And if you wanted to have a new kind of animal, you would have to add information. And I think that is very, very important. The only time you really get a beneficial mutation is when you're adding functionality or diversity or possibly even a new kind through this mutation. Now that is hardly ever observed, especially not new kinds. But it could be that a mutation has an advantageous effect on the organism, but there will always be a loss of information in some way. If you have a misprint in a book of yours and it is about a domestic dog that you have, and by accident you spell it as C-A-T, then it changes the character of the story substantially. But you still haven't created a new kind of animal by just having the letters CAT instead of DOG. Okay, now Darwin's hope was in transition fossils that would eventually validate his hypothesis. And today, I think I read not so long ago that we have more than 200 million pieces of fossils, but we also still have many living fossils, because animals were classified as being fossils as they were found in their dry bones state. But then they discovered years later that this animal, this fish, the coelacanth, was estimated to have become extinct 70 million years ago. And then they found one, actually off the coast of South Africa. And in the meantime, they found quite a few of them. The chambered nautilus, a kind of a shell thing. I don't really know too much about these animals, but I've seen pictures. They said there were 180 million years ago that they went extinct. Well, the sea is full of them still. And now the biggest surprise in the last 5 or 10 years, they discovered some fossil bone, and looking very closely under a microscope, they found some tissue on it. And that tissue was even still elastic. And of course, it was a big commotion, and they thought it was contamination and so on. But it's been done a few times now, and even blood particles. So that is quite amazing. Why is that amazing? Because they couldn't be 66 million years old, whatever age it is. Natural processes would produce new species, according to Charles Darwin, but that meant we would have new kinds, unlimited new kinds. Now, 150, 160 years ago, that was really revolutionary thought. But there was no hard fact evidence for that. No real observations. And even up to today, it is biologically unfounded. Molecular and cellular science has really improved so much in the last 20 to 30 years through the insight we got into genetics. And genetics has really falsified the idea of Darwin's origin. And falsified means that that's not how it happened. The Darwinian hypothesis, be it the question of origin or gradual improvement for the better and the better, just improvement, is now scientifically at least totally unsustainable. You all know Darwin's idea now, and you've probably known it before. There's a tree of life, there's an original, and then it branched off, and these branches had more branches, and that is how the various animals and so on came to be. And if you look at that at the top, it's not so far off of what a creation act described in Genesis could look like. Because where we could say, instead of having a tree of life with a single origin, we might have separate kinds that all developed in their own way, and they are growing up and populating the earth and so on. And yes, there are adaptations and variations in the kinds. So each one of these orchard trees are kinds, and then there are slight variations of these kinds. If you look at that bottom picture there on this slide, you would see that one of those is maybe the wolf kind, another one is the horse kind, the other one is the cat kind. And then there are the extinct kinds that are no longer with us, that for whatever reason died out, like the dodo bird. Okay, so created kinds is not the same as species, and the man-made classification systems of all these various families and the way they do it with genus and species and family and so on are not always very consistent. And what is important here is to understand there is a fixity of kinds, but there is not fixity of species. What that means is cats can only reproduce with other cats. A cat cannot reproduce together with a kudu, besides that the one will eat the other. But it's not fixed in species. There can be adaptations. So that is what Darwin actually saw, that these birds that he observed on the finches, I think the Galapagos finches, had different beaks and so on. But that you see in our environments too. That's an adaptation. So this tree of evolution morphology versus the orchard morphology, as I here call it, are different paradigms. But I think the orchard model makes more sense in the light of the real evidence that we have. When I go to a national museum, be it in South Africa or overseas, which I occasionally do, then in the museum we see that there are displays typically like this. They say this top animal over many, many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years changed into this Pisicatus or whatever it's called, and then into the next one, and then into the next one, and that one looks almost like a whale. So that is the evolutionary tree of a whale. I'm trying to make a very simple, paleontologist can probably rip me to pieces, but this sequence is actually taken from a museum plaque. So when you look at this and you try and find out where did these animals live, how do they know what they look like, you find that they may have found a piece of the skull or a piece of a toe or a tooth or whatever. And then the artistic rendering of these animals look very, very different. But be that as it may, it doesn't matter how they change the shape and the homology of this. The evidence, in inverted commas, is based on a very few spuriously collected fossils. Often they don't even know if a bone from the one animal may not be a bone from another one. So there's a lot of conjecture. There is no doubt about it. And this is meant to be one of the best examples of how animals have evolved. Look at this. Here's another one from another museum. Here are all the fossils that they have from various birds and dinosaurs. They have different classifications of dinosaurs, which is fine. That's classifications based on the fossils. Remember, the exact looks we didn't know, or we don't know, especially not like Jurassic Park, because they're colored in and there's a lot of artistic license there. But here is the shocking thing. In the museum, the plaque looked like this without the zeros in it. All it said is there's an unknown common ancestor, and then you got all these branches, and you have all these other animals. That's not science. Let's not kid ourselves. That is a very, very big jump from the unknown ancestor to these fossil animals, which were different, yes, but they were part of the dinosaur group. And the birds are somewhat thrown in as well. All right? Okay. We can talk about that for a long time, you know. But if we compare the skulls of dogs, I tell you what, if we were to find them somewhere in the Grand Canyon, we would classify these two skulls as different animals altogether. But they're not different animals. They are the class of dogs, which are wolves with very, very long mutations. And the mutations have been induced by breeders, by human beings. And there are hundreds of types of dogs today, and they all have different head bones, but they're one species. And the kind from where they came were the wolves. But will a dog ever turn back into a wolf? Very unlikely. No, in fact, impossible. Why? Because each mutation from the wolf down lost information. So yes, you got some that are very small. They can never get very big again. You have some that have got long tails, short tails. It's unlikely that you will ever breed them back into long tails. And when it comes to fur and stuff like that, it's the same. Here's the biggie, of course. There are some ape skulls on the left and some human skulls on the right. And of course, the guy in the middle must be the transition. So here is Darwin's tree. And look at the top there, that's where you are, and me, of course, by implication. And these others are just ape kinds and humanoids. Nobody really knows, but they just put them on a new branch if they can't see any sort of likenesses between them. And the likenesses are all based on fossil bones, and very, very rarely do you actually get a complete skeleton. And it is usually mixed up with a lot of other animal bones. So if we get back to these three sort of ape pictures, the problem isn't that we don't have enough fossils. There are lots of fossils, but they don't fit the evolutionary hypothesis, because a newly discovered skull gets a new name, because you see, it's very important for the paleontologist to be a discoverer of something new. And everybody in that field wants to discover the transition. That skeleton that shows here we have a half an ape and half a man. And so every time they find something, they age it, or they date it rather, and they get an age. That's another story that is not as straightforward as what you might think. And so they give these human beings names. Sometimes they reckon there are more ape, but they found out now also, as genetics is getting smarter and smarter, that an ape is an ape and a human is a human. And now we discovered that the Neanderthalers, who were always considered sort of half-half, were fully human, with language, with culture, with appreciation of art and music and so on. And then you get something like the Naledi story, of course. What a commotion it was. And you know that the skeleton that they have there are actually hundreds of skeletons that were found in a cave. And yeah, I don't want to go too deep into it, but it is actually conjecture upon conjecture upon conjecture upon conjecture. And in the end, we have a Naledi story of which none of it is fact, except that we have the bones. So you can hear that I sound very skeptical, very radical almost. So why cling to this idea of origin that Darwin proposed? Well, the answer is, you remember from our first talk, the worldview. And many people have a, let's say, atheistic worldview. If the worldview is atheistic, then you have a prior commitment to materialism. And that's been like that probably since about Darwin, around the 1800s, 1900s. But you get some very big, great people, very intelligent, clever people. Harvard geneticist Richard Lewontin said, and I can find for you the quotes, "Materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow the divine a foot in the door." What does that sentence say? And the following one also, "Our faith in evolution depends on our reluctance to accept the antagonistic doctrine of special creation." Now, why would that be antagonistic? And why would you not want to allow the divine a foot in the door? If the theory of evolution cannot be proven from the facts, you can actually only promote it as dogma, or at best as a philosophy. And if it is a philosophy, then you're based on faith. And that's why I also say I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, because the evidence is too little. Let me go somewhere else quickly. Design and purpose relate to parts and the function of that system. So I want to show it to you on a motor car. The average car components are about 30 to 70,000 pieces. The average pieces for a Boeing 747 or an Airbus 380 are roughly 6 to 7 million components. Now, there's a car, there's an aeroplane. The aeroplane is not flying 6 to 7 million pieces in formation, and the car is not just held together, but it has a function. So if we call the car the system of interest, or the aeroplane the system of interest, then it is not just a collection of parts. These are parts, and they do not have the function that the car or the aeroplane had. Definitely not. So we have a heap, and this is also just a heap, even if it is very nicely arranged. So here we've got all the motor car components maybe arranged, every single nut and bolt and tire and whatnot. There it is. But is it functionally a car? No, it isn't. It's parts. Each part was designed for a specific function, but the way it's lying there, it cannot perform that function. So this one, fully assembled, when you turn the ignition key and it is running, you have a system that functions as intended. So that was the purpose of the design of this car, to give mobility. And the same with the aircraft, of course. So what had to be added to go from a heap of separate parts to an assembled motor car with its intended function as a motor car system? What had to be added? Intelligence, information, and energy for action. I want to show you something that's mind-boggling in biology. I just wanted to bring the car story in so that you can relate to it very easily. Here we have a caterpillar on the left. This caterpillar, for its life as a caterpillar, is eating leaves from a very specific shrub. And that depends on the type of caterpillar or moth that's going to come out of these chrysalis. Or chrysalis, or chrysalis, whichever way you pronounce it. These are sequences of pictures to show how this changes into a butterfly. Now the metamorphosis that is taking place here is mind-boggling. And people took these caterpillars once they hook themselves up to the branch, and they CAT scanned them every single day, maybe a couple of times during the day. And what they found is something very, very interesting. The caterpillar's inside dissolves completely. All the organs inside there that was necessary for the function that a caterpillar has was dissolved, and then over time changed in structure inside there. And when the time came, after a couple of days, I think it's between 14 and 20 or 30 days, depending on the type of butterfly or moth that you have, then out comes the monarch butterfly. This butterfly is completely different in its function. The caterpillar was eating leaves. The butterfly is drinking nectar from plants. This butterfly can fly. The caterpillar can crawl. The food is different, as I said, and the whole system of the monarch butterfly is highly mobile. It is actually migrating. Each generation is migrating all the way to Canada and the United States, all the way to Mexico. Huh? That's amazing. That navigational system is built in there. That is, in human engineering terms, would be like taking a Model Ford and then in a couple of hours on its own, it converts all the components to this. There, the Ford is crawling on the ground, and there, the helicopter is flying through the air. The function of both is completely different, and you can tell me what you like, it'll never change spontaneously from the one to the other. What needs to be done, if that is even possible in engineering, which it isn't, by the way, but biologically too, you need an instruction manual. There's got to be an instruction to change the caterpillar to a monarch butterfly. What is that instruction? And look at a bird's wing. Human beings get very clever and they copy biology, because you remember 50 years ago, aeroplanes didn't have winglets. Aeroplanes didn't have leading edge flaps. That happened later. But the birds had it all along. Look at this. Look at the wingtips of an eagle. And that is how most gliding birds get a lot of extra lift, additional lift, by having these wingtips bent up. And of course, human beings copy that. The leading edge flaps are also not such a sort of a invention of human beings. We found it on the birds first and then said, what does it do? Oh, is that what it does? Let's see if we can copy that. And we do. And there is a completely, entirely new engineering discipline. It's called biomimetrics, where we check what nature is doing and we have a look in terms of materials or processes or certain characteristics if we can't copy that. So let's focus on human biology. But if we focus on the human biology, we see the human being consists of many subsystems. And here's just a picture. There's a skeletal system, there's the muscular system, the blood circulation system, and the nervous system in this picture that I've shown there. So the system of interest takes a whole specialist who studied probably for 5 or 7 years to get this into their brain, okay? There are a lot of fundamentals at the detail level in all these systems of interest, and that is the cells themselves, the cellular metabolism. How does the blood supply work and the diffusion of the blood under different circumstances of activity? How does that affect the performance of the human being, physically or mentally? How do we maintain our health, or how does the body maintain its health? Let's put it like that. And how does it, in case of ailments and wounds, repair itself? There's also an immune system, because the big five that can actually eat you are tiny little viruses and bacteria. They are much worse than a lion, a crocodile, or a buffalo. So the immune system is there to prevent these vicious little things to contaminate you. And then there's, of course, also genetics and information and so on. So there's a lot of stuff there, a lot of stuff. That is all happening in your body while I sit here, while you sit in front of your screen at home, and you listen to all this. You have no idea as yet what is all happening in your body. But I do want to give you just a very quick rundown. Think about it. The human organism, this body of yours, is self-regulating. You are not regulating your blood pressure, your body temperature, your sugar levels consciously. You don't do that. This body is also networked. And what I mean by networked is, if you got a toothache, your whole body knows about it. If you got a pain in the foot or a wound, your whole body knows about it. It's very networked. And a lot of chemistry is going on to combat this pain that you have, because the body knows that is an aberration. The default position of a human being is actually to be healthy, and sickness is an aberration, and the body is trying to fix it. And it optimizes its resources very well, be that blood, be that energy, be that certain chemicals. And the amazing thing for a technical person, it is self-healing. So when I have a wound, and I say this with respect to the doctors and the medical professionals, but it is the body that heals itself. The doctors or medication or some other gadgets actually only assist in the body healing itself. My point in this is that it's already built into the body. It's not something that comes from outside. The whole process of healing, of optimizing, of self-regulating is built in. And then, of course, in the human being, there is a spiritual dimension, which a crocodile doesn't have, which a dog doesn't have, no other animal has, but the human being has. Be you an atheist or not, you have a spiritual dimension. And here's one of these subsystems, and that is the circulatory system. Everything, every single cell in your body all 100 million of them actually get their energy, actually get their nutrients and their oxygen with which they produce energy, they get it through the circulatory system. And the highways here are the arteries and the veins, and the byways are the smaller microcirculation and the capillaries. So the highway for the immune system is also the circulatory system is also the highway for the immune system and other life-critical materials that float in the blood. There has to be an uninterrupted flow and proper diffusion, because otherwise you can get a stroke or you can bleed internally or whatever. And you know that there are 120,000 kilometers. Yes, you heard that right. 120,000 kilometers of blood vessels buried in your body. I don't know who they took as a volunteer to measure it, but 90,000 kilometers of those 120,000 are actually microcirculation. That means where the pipes are thinner than 1/5 of a millimeter. That's the diameter of the beginning of the microcirculation. Okay, so you say, okay, good blood circulation isn't everything. Now that's true, but there's a medical term for if it doesn't work, you're dead. There are many other subsystems, as we said already. The skeletal system, the digestive system, and so on. And then we have all these tissues and organs in the body that work on a different basis, that have different functions, but they all contribute to the top function of the human body, the human being. Okay? And if we look at the medical specialists, they study for years to just become a specialist in, let's say, the liver. So let's have a look at the liver. There is a bit of tissue of the liver. And here is what's really going on in the liver in terms of the chemistry. Now look at this diagram on the right. I do not claim for a moment that I understand what it says there. It's a liver biochemical pathway, and the one at the top is the liver cell process. Now here's the amazing thing. It took a lot of intelligence, a couple of PhDs probably, who had to develop this diagram, because if one of those arrows there on the right diagram, or the little squares, is not functioning properly, that liver isn't functioning properly, and you have a serious liver problem. And here I sit. I have no idea how that works, and my liver knows how it works. It's working. It's running programs and processes all the time, and it's working. And I thank the Lord that it is working. But my point is, it's an extremely complex process, and it is directed and controlled internally by this body. You want to tell me that even on this one aspect, let's say the liver, that this happened randomly? There is no way this diagram and the processes behind it can happen randomly, without purpose. There is purpose in this plan. Okay? You would agree with that. Because if there is no purpose, you don't need a liver. But you do need a liver. And here is an individual cell, of which I've said it a few times now. You've got 100 million of them. Every second, you lose about 50 to 80 million of them. But it doesn't matter, because through cell division, you get new ones. But if you look at a diagram like this is a very different diagram to the one that Darwin would have drawn you. The cell in the head of Darwin was just a blob, remember? In 1856 or 59, they had no idea what that simple blob really looks like and what it does. look at this little diagram. The purple area there with the nucleus is an outrageously complex factory with biological machinery that you wouldn't dream of. These oranges, a mitochondrion is actually the power station, except it works better than ESCOM. But the mitochondrion have in them tiny little generators, thousands of them, and they generate energy. There are lots of aspects we could talk about here, probably for another day as well. Let me give you some other information here. The 100 trillion cells are working together. They're working together, functionally, like every screw and nut and bolt in that Boeing 747 and that car. They are building over 250,000, think about that, 250,000 different types of protein from a program that is locked up in the DNA. They got to find the needed proteins building instruction, and then they copy the appropriate section of DNA. They transcribe it and translate it, and they populate it, and with the right sequence of 20 different amino acids, it makes a protein. It is an enormously complex process to build just one protein. But our body together produces in all the cells 15,000, just think of that number, 15,000 billion proteins per second. So it is just outrageous what is happening there in your body. And I think you should get a bit more awe for the complexity of the body that you inhabit, because it is just mind-boggling. And nobody can tell me that the complexity of that machine called the cell as a subsystem of a bigger system like the liver, which has to work in the human body system, that can all come about by random chance. You must be kidding. You must be kidding. Gets better. These little colored sticks are sort of stylized amino acid bars. There are 20 different types that the body uses, and these little bars are strung up in a particular sequence. Let's say 2 yellow ones, 1 red one, and then a green one, and then 2 blue ones, and then 2 gray ones, and then 4 light green ones, etc. And then these amino acids, and there can be over 1,500 or 2,000 in a protein, they then get folded in a particular shape so that a protein can be built. And if the sequence of the amino acids isn't right, you have a problem with that protein. It's not going to work. And if it is folded incorrectly, you also have a problem. That problem is probably a serious illness. So, there's another little trick about the amino acids. They come in 2 versions, symmetrical, one like this and one like that. But the body only uses the one half. It produces both, but it ignores the right-handed ones. It only uses the left-handed ones in this molecule configuration. That's interesting, because that makes it even more difficult to build a protein, because the body now has to have enough amino acids to choose from, and it only chooses the left-hand ones, not the right-hand ones. And when they are folded, they look a little bit like this. And hello, this is complex. The different colors refer to the different amino acids. These shapes and forms, when you look at it in specialized sort of pictures, and these days we can look at all these things on Google. I mean, I lifted these images off Google, not the sticks. The sticks I could make myself. So this is what it looks like. And if you go into the detail, the shapes and the way they fit together is critical for the function of this protein to work. And just to take the hemoglobin one is folded in this particular way, as you see there on the bottom right. And there are little gaps in this molecule or in that structure of the protein, that shows you where the hemoglobin molecule fits in exactly, because that's where the oxygen gets stored when the blood and the red blood particles go past the alveoli in the lung, and the oxygen naturally migrates into these little holes, and then when it goes to the blood circulatory system and it gets to the capillaries, it releases that oxygen to the cell. Now, if you didn't plan that, as evolution is blind, remember, and purposeless, then you would never have thought of putting the oxygen in these holes. And only the oxygen, by the way, fits into these holes. CO2 wouldn't fit in there, nitrogen wouldn't fit in there, only oxygen. Great. That protein has to be folded in the right way, the molecules have to fit, etc. It's complex, it's mind-boggling. But just a few words about the mitochondrion. The mitochondria are the power stations that provide the energy for the work that is done by the cell, because there's a lot of work being done in the cell. Even when you are totally at rest, but you are alive, then all these things are working. They are working. In a complex biological process, it converts sugar to useful chemical energy. And you see these little red dots there. They are called the ATP synthase. And the ATP synthase are little motors that generate ATP. And ATP is an abbreviation for adenosine triphosphate, which this little motor makes. And without adenosine triphosphate, there is a word for a medical expression that says you're dead. So all these motors do is they produce energy so that your cell can do the work that it has to do. And all the cells in your body produce about 75 kilograms of ATP a day. Now, why don't you gain any weight? Because it uses it within seconds. It uses this up. But I want to recommend to you that you check out on YouTube some of these animations on how these things work. It's amazing. You cannot believe it. And this little motor is not running on electrons. It's running on hydrogen ions, or protons, if you like. There it is. Lots of them. Lots and lots of them. And how it all starts at conception with two cells. The male sperm, the female egg, and it starts off like this. Only one will win. Then it splits, and there's a couple more cells, and then the cells organize themselves to give it a bit of shape, and a bit of more shape after 42 days and 8 months, to result in this. That program is written in the DNA, and each one of these little blobs on the left have the full package of the DNA, each one of them. So what do we need in the universe? Not just matter and energy. You know, up to the 1960s and 70s, and some scientists still believe that the universe is matter and energy, and that is all there is, get over it. Well, they forgot one important aspect. Somehow there's got to be information, because the genetic code is an enormous amount of information. And information requires intelligence. And also it requires purpose. Because what's the point of having information if nobody else can use it? Or why would anyone organize information if it isn't useful for something? And that gets us to the DNA, which is really the alphabet of our building program. The blueprint for every human being is in this DNA. Every single human being has variations in the DNA. That's why we look the way we look. And that's why we are different, although we're all the same in a way. But if we take the DNA, and you've all seen pictures already, and I'm way beyond my time here, but this is a video, so you can take your time. You can always have a cup of coffee in between. My live one will be shorter, definitely has to be shorter. But this alphabet only consists of these 4 letters, A, T, C, and G. And imagine you have a language and a written language that only consists of 4 letters. And this is what this system is. This system is a biological system where these letters are arranged in a certain way, the double helix. You've all heard about it, even if you maybe not understand it. But by analogy of letters, it could be representative of a book of about 3 billion words, or 3 million pages of 1,000 words on each page. Now, the average book has about 200 words on a page. But here's the thing. All that information is in each cell. Now, look at this. The book, The Human Genome, and that's why it took so long to get it the first time, is your complete DNA with 3 billion letters. And the pages are not neatly arranged how you would read a book. It would look a little bit like this extract there, where there are just strings of letters, these 4 letters that we've got. And it's just rows. But what we don't see there is where the one word stops and the next one begins. There's a certain sequence in there that you and I don't know. The geneticists, of course, know that, but you don't know. But that's not our point anyway. So here we have the book of the human genome. And my particular book would be called Genotype. And that is the totality of all my hereditary material, again, in each cell. A single gene is often more than 10,000 nucleotides long. Chromosomes are the structures within cells that contain all the genes. So a chromosome contains hundreds of thousands of genes. So in summary, the DNA are these 4 individual letters. They make nucleotides, okay? And in the end, we collect those in genes and in chromosomes. And that looks like this. Very quickly. There's a DNA. You can see the DNA. It sort of coils and folds around particularly designed proteins. It's like you winding them up on a ball, okay? And then these balls are curled again and into a sort of a shape that is very clear there on the diagram. And then all these things fit into a collection which is a chromosome. And these chromosomes, again, it gets more and more amazing. You now know what a chromosome is. It's a collection of a specific type of information from the DNA. And we have 24 of these chromosomes, each of us. Okay? Except a woman. And I tell you why now. Because there are 24 pictures of chromosomes there, but a woman has an X twice and no Y, and a man has an X and a Y. So the difference between a man and a woman on this picture would be a woman would have 2 X chromosomes and a man would have an X and a Y. Okay. So here are the chromosomes, and another way to depict that is you see the gene. Those are maybe the words or the sentence, whatever. We have an intergenic region before we get to the next gene. And in this long DNA list, you've got to find where's the spot where the one starts and the other one ends. So when you fold this all up into a chromosome and you put the chromosomes together, because they're all the genes as well, but all the DNA is packed into these 24 chromosomes, and then these again are sitting in the core of your cell. Are you still with me? This is complicated, but not in principle. In principle, And you don't have to understand it. You must just appreciate for the moment how complex all this is. So here's another picture of this. From the DNA, we get into the chromosome, and here's another discovery they made. Each one of those chromosomes has on their extremities a little spot called a telomere, and the telomere is a counter. It counts exactly how often this cell has already been split. A cell can reproduce itself by splitting, but there's only a certain number of divisions possible before that cell dies. So somehow this is like a counter until this cell will die. This telomere is a counter. And then there is another thing. Do you remember when this whole genetic thing started, and people looked at all these genes and so on, they found that there's a lot of DNA that they couldn't allocate to any function. And they called it junk DNA. And today, 20 years later, they say, the biologists say, that was probably the biggest blunder they ever made, because they didn't know what this DNA was for. So they decided, in line with evolutionary theory, or hypothesis I would rather say, that because they didn't know what it means, that it must be a leftover from the evolutionary trail that our organism went through historically before we got to where we got. But now they are finding that all this DNA has a function, and what's more, it is packaged in a way that is three-dimensional, not flat like these drawings. It's three-dimensional, and it changes over time with phases of your life. So these chromosomes and this whole book gets rearranged and rewritten, or should I say rearranged, that's a better one, so that the chromosomes even are located in different places, indicated here in the different colors of the different chromosomes. But it's three-dimensional, and you could have the arm of number 3 being split up into 3 regions over there, and they're not next to each other. And they've only discovered that now. So not only is the DNA an amazingly complex structure to write all sorts of information, the building of the proteins is just one of them, and that's amazing enough. And now they find that not only are these chromosomes, in other words, all the DNA, packaged in these coils and countercoils and so on, but they're also arranged three-dimensionally, and they change with a life phase. So as a young child, it looks different to a teenager, to an adult, to an octogenarian. So it's amazing, and they're still discovering. They still don't know everything. Well, they never will. Here's a thing that's a bit sad, but also a proof. Proof is maybe the wrong word, but for me it's a proof. But the evidence is that humankind is not evolving. It is actually devolving, because our lifespan has declined. If you're a believer or not, doesn't matter now. But the ages of the people in the Bible, if you plot them on a graph and you take today's life expectancies, you get this graph there in the middle of the page, or the right-hand graph, okay? Now, that's not something Moses or anybody else could have thought up, because this curve, if you plot it, actually coincides with what we find due to genetics now. So the declining lifespan of Noah's descendants and where we are today and where we go is already predictable, and we suffer from something called genetic entropy. All that means is things are winding down. Why? Because all the bad mutations, the negative mutations that we suffer, are cumulative. I have all those of all my ancestors in my genes. In my human genome, the genotype, every single bad mutation is locked up in there. So you and I, we are all mutants. There's no kidding. We are mutants. Unfortunately, it's a declining slope that we're on. And the fitness has nothing to do with physical fitness. It just means that the genetic setup of humanity has declined over the last 300 generations, something like the curve on the right. So that is going down. Our genetic fitness and our life expectancy is going down. So we're almost done. There's another thing that biology shows today, which it never used to. If you look at the evidence for a first male and a first female, you'll get a surprise, or rather the atheist got a surprise now. Because all males carry this chromosome X and Y, you remember? And the Y is always inherited from the father since time began. Whenever that was, whatever the atheist says, whatever the Christian says, whatever your worldview, the Y is inherited from the father to the son since time begins. But besides the mutations that do happen, even on the Y chromosome, the Ys are similar to all males in the world. So we're all brothers, like it or not. Okay? So the Y connects every man on this planet to each other. And the research of secular biological science has actually confirmed this. And now the evolutionists are very, very surprised because there are no highly divergent Ys. What that means is there are no Y chromosomes that are so weird and off the map that one could say they are creating something new. They are basically the same package. The same package. And there is only one type. And they have tested tens of thousands of males in the whole world, from Japan to the United States to South Africa to Europe, whatever. And they find the Ys are all the same. Hello. The females, interesting enough, because they have two X's in their configuration, they had to find something else to trace them with. And they did. It's called the mitochondrial DNA, which gets inherited from female to female to female. So the fathers are not involved here in the sense of the heritage of the mtDNA, the mitochondrial DNA. And if there is ever a bottleneck in population, you know, like people all die off and there are only 8 people left, like happened in Noah's time, okay? Believe in the flood or not, doesn't matter. There were only 8 people because science has now discovered there were actually 8 people, of which 3 were daughters. And the daughter's mtDNA is identifiable in the population of today. And yes, the females are also related, but there are 3 different sort of branches of mitochondrial DNA with their own mutations, but they can be traced back. And they're called M, N, and R, and you don't have to worry about any of this. But the females have these 3 sequences in their mitochondrial DNA, which indicates there were only 3 women. Now, where do these 3 women come from? Well, they could come from Noah's Ark, because there were 3 daughters-in-law to Noah and his wife. And they, of course, had, unless they were sisters, those 3 had their own mitochondrial DNA. So there were 3 versions that now, in different combinations, can give you slightly different women types in the sense of mitochondrial DNA. So the mitochondrial DNA can be mixed in people migrations. If you believe in Babel or not, doesn't matter. But there was migration of females and males. The male Y doesn't change very much. And the female, we only got 3 branches. Again, the evolutionists are very surprised, because that cannot possibly be. Because that would point to a common mother and a common father for the whole of humanity. That is a little bit too close for comfort, because that's what Genesis says as well, right? So, some facts in summary and then we're done. Spontaneous generation of life has never been observed. That's why I didn't even discuss it. It gets put on the table occasionally, but it's never been observed. There have been experiments like the Urey-Miller experiment, which was debunked in 1956 already. Secondly, the DNA molecule cannot be replicated by combining the constituent chemicals in a lab. It is a highly unstable thing outside of the genome. So the complexity of building a protein you will only appreciate when you see a video. And I've given you some, or I will give you some links. You can actually search for it yourself, but I'll give you the links that I thought were most useful. Now, the complexity of building a protein is really mind-boggling. The machinery involved is fantastic, and as I said, it's about 18,000 million proteins built a second. With quality control, with checking if the copying was done right. Packed into 3 billion letter human genome book, and that's absolutely awesome. Your book has been written. Mathematically, the probability of even building one simple protein correctly from 100 amino acids without the complicated folding involved is about 1 to 10 to the 22. If you don't know that sort of description, it just means your chance is 1 against a 1 with 22 zeros behind it. That is as good as impossible. I mean, you think winning the lotto is difficult. Well, having a chance of 1 in 10 to the power 22 is as good as impossible. Just to give you in perspective what a number like that size-wise means. I said you consist of 100 trillion cells. That is written as 10 to the power 14. So it's a 1 with 14 zeros. That's a big number. But to build one protein is 10 to the power 22. And that is, every time you add a 0, you tenfold the previous one. So these are big numbers. That's why you get from a 10 to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000, later to million, and so on. So the number of seconds that, according to secular science, has passed since the Big Bang, if it ever existed, which I don't believe like that, is 10 to the power 22. 10 to the power 16. That's a much smaller number than the probability of folding a single protein with only 100 amino acids. Most proteins consist of thousands of amino acids. You know that there are 10 to the power 19 sand grains on this planet? Who counted them? I have no idea. But I suppose it is a sort of a calculation, you know, per cubic centimeter, then per cubic meter, then per this, per that. The sand grains on this planet are about 10 to the 19. The number of atoms in the universe is 10 to the power 80. That's a big number. That's an outrageously big number. But then this known universe is pretty big. And the specific parameters that make the Earth just right for human living, including the position of the Earth, the constituents of the Earth in the atmosphere, the sun and its characteristics, the position of the Earth with respect to the Sun, the position of our Sun and solar system in the galaxy, the Milky Way, etc., and the tilt for the seasons and so on. If you take all those parameters and you have a look at the chance that that would all come together for human life to exist, you get to a number 10 to the power 120. Now, I know these numbers are mind-boggling, and they are. And honestly, it doesn't matter if there are 3 zeros wrong on any of those. Those numbers are bigger than anything the Guptas could have taken. Anyway, ATP generators are electric proton motors, as I already said. They are irreducibly complex. That fancy word just means if you take one component out of that motor, it will not work anymore. So evolution had quite a thing to build one of those randomly. It's like building an outboard motor randomly but forgetting the propeller. Then the whole outboard motor is not going to work, right? Except this is much more complex, much more complex. These little motors, by the way, rotate at 10,000 RPM. 10,000 RPM. I already mentioned the negative mutations, the letter errors, but these letter errors are predominantly 1,000 to 1 bad mutations. Bad mutations. And they're all cumulative. But that means that humankind and animal kinds are not evolving to higher forms from generation to generation, but they are seriously deteriorating. Now, that has been proven now genetically and shown to be true thousands of times. Genetic entropy, this decline, is like the coffee getting cold, the universe getting cold and old, and so do we. Don't believe it? Look in the mirror. There are 8 female variations of the mitochondrial DNA and only 1 male chromosome. But, it's a long calculation you say, but earlier you said 3, that's right. There is a calculation involved there, which I'm not going to repeat now. But all males are directly related to one ancestor, and there are only 3 female variations worldwide. And they also lead to one source, those 3. If you take one and you take the origin of humankind back to its places, then you find that one of those 3 letters, the MN or R, are actually ending up in Eve. But that's what the Christian believes, okay? But it's close enough, people. It is close enough. There's no scientific literature for molecular evolution, and I've read widely on this. There is no literature, none. Evolution plays no role either in practical biological science. It doesn't matter in which lab you go, in which aspect of molecular biology you work in, or genetics. Evolution is never a topic because it has no practical application whatsoever. And it's just really a figment of the imagination. And I think that's it then. Design is simply the purposeful arrangement of parts. Now, all the parts we discussed, and we are nowhere near the whole spectrum, implies a purpose. And purpose implies, again, planning, intelligence, and a top-down process. Because if you don't know when you are designing a Boeing or a Volkswagen car from the beginning, then you're never going to get there. You're just never going to get there. You can take all the screws and all the nuts and bolts and all the panels and everything that you've ever made for any reason, throw them all on a heap. It'll never become a car. So life on Earth at its most fundamental level, in its most critical components, is the product of an intelligent activity. Genesis 1 showed us how it was created. You believe it or not, doesn't matter. But Genesis 1 showed us how it was done. And modern operational science shows us how it works Remember this term that I used, prescriptive and descriptive. And it indirectly, with a little bit I told you, there's a lot of background there, it indirectly confirms the veracity of Noah, and it also alludes to an original couple which we call Adam and Eve. Indeed, for the extreme fine-tuning in human biology alone, a supernatural intelligence is most likely. I would say it's actually impossible without it. Darwinian evolution, though, as a scientific hypothesis, is totally irrational and unreasonable. So, the point I wanted to make once again here is not to prove anything to you, but to make you think about what you've heard. Research it by all means. Read on both sides. Listen to YouTube talks, TED talks, whatever. Just remember that most secular scientists have a worldview which may or may not be shared by yourself, because their sort of point of departure is this universe is only material and energy. There is no divine intervention of any sort. And the Christians, they are just believing in an old book. Well, guess what? This old book has a lot of truth in it that is confirmed with modern science today. There's a bit of a joke. The scientists are climbing a mountain to try and find the truth, and as they get to the top, they find the Christian theologian sitting there already. And yeah, thank you very much for listening and having a look at this video. I know it was a bit long, but a video you can always stop, have a cup of coffee and come back. Thanks a lot. Have a good day still. Bye.